This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 173 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's topic is anxiety and travel. This is one that we've covered a couple of times before, but some time back now, a couple of years back now. If you want to know more about anxiety and travel, go back to episode 71 about getting past travel anxiety, and episode 93 about how to deal with travel anxiety. But in today's episode, I speak with two fabulous women who I've had the pleasure of meeting both of them over the years. And I really am so impressed and so much appreciate their very honest tales about their experiences of anxiety and travel, which I guess means I need to, reiterate some of mine. I've mentioned it in other episodes, but if you haven't heard those in the past, I guess my long story short, is when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I had quite crippling anxiety. I dropped out of university for a while, almost pretty much dropped out of life, could barely leave the house for a time, really couldn't leave the house without having, terrible panic attacks and stuff like that. Anyway, over time with lots of different help, they improved. And I always feel, and, I don't think I'm wrong in thinking this, but that travel really, really helped the most, because after a few years of that is when I then moved to live in Japan for a couple of years and then moved on to Europe, before eventually returning to Australia. But it's just it was amazing to me that after a short time in Japan, I was not anxious. It was kind of all gone. I think, the triggers from home had disappeared, and suddenly, it was all new. It was all different. And I was amazingly, mentally healthy again. Since then, of course, I have, really had a blessed life and been able to find work that I love, work for myself, do this kind of work with the podcast and the blog. And I think that kind of combination of, being more in control of my life has helped that a lot. But that's the short story. But both of the stories today from Megan and from Laura have so much resonance with my own experiences. It was really quite amazing. So anyway, my first guest today is Megan Blandford. We chatted about another mental health issue some episodes back last year when Megan spoke about depression and travel in episode 137. I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to that if you haven't as well, because it was really some riveting stuff I found. But of course, Megan has had experience both with depression and anxiety, quite different things. And she was very kind to come on and talk about what it's like to experience anxiety when you are actually traveling.
There's been some interesting times with experiencing anxiety with traveling. So that's sometimes that's in anticipation of a trip.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of years ago, we went to Japan, and it was a fantastic trip, and we did Disneyland with the kids and we took them skiing, and it was brilliant. But there was this portion of the trip. So we were staying in Shinjuku, which is known for having the busiest train station in the world.
Yes.
And we were planning on taking the train all around Tokyo. So we looked up Shinjuku, and you see these images.
Yes, they're famous, aren't they? Yes.
People being pushed onto the trains to fit in.
Yeah.
And the streets just absolutely packed with people. And so in an anxious mind, that becomes quite difficult. And I'm thinking, why are we going there? And so leading up to the trip, I was really anxious, and
Mm-hmm.
I was really on edge, and I couldn't sleep because I was convinced, my mind was absolutely convinced that we were going to lose at least one of our children, if not
gosh, yes. Oh, yeah.
So it was really real to me, this idea. And I was thinking, should we not go there now? Should we not take the trains? What are we going to do? Anyway, we got there, and the kids were furious with me because I would not let them go. I was gripping onto their hands. And we live in a country town here in Australia.
So you don't usually.
They are not used to that. No, they run wild. We have acreage and they just run around everywhere. We go into town and they're, running ahead and going off to the shops by themselves and all of this. And so we're there in Tokyo, and I'm gripping onto them because I'm still convinced that if I let go of one of them, they're going to be swept away
in the crowds of people.
From the crowd. Yeah, and the crowds they were big crowds, but they weren't as intense as the images you see.
That's right.
Time we were there. But I still, you're dealing with these anxious thoughts that, it's easy to think, well, that's ridiculous. You're not going to lose your kids. And, in Japan, my kids stick out.
Yes,
and people are very helpful. So, it would probably all work out. If they did,
exactly. If you're going to lose your kids anywhere, Japan's probably the place to lose them.
Yeah. But, in an anxious mind, things seem really real.
It's amazing to me that that's your example, because it's really funny. So before I left Australia to live abroad, so whatever, 14, 15 years ago, I'd had a lot of issues with anxiety, and it was one of the reasons that I decided to move abroad. I thought this will help. But my first stop was living in Japan, and I actually, in the month or so before we moved there, I had a really long series of nightmares of not losing a child, but of those crowded trains, because I just thought, I can't cope with that. That's going to be horrifying. I that was like my number one anxiety about moving to Japan, was being crushed on the trains like that. And of course, in reality, it turned out I was in Osaka for a start, not Tokyo, so they were never quite so bad. I traveled not usually during peak because my shifts at school were like midday to 9 p.m. And also, I'm much taller than the average Japanese, so I never really felt crushed. I was always like a head above them. There's all these things that made it turn out totally fine. But I really was really, really worried about that before I went. So I completely hear. And add in 2 small children. Completely understand how you could be really freaking out about that before you get there.
Yeah. And I guess another example of the anxiety thing is when we went to New Zealand, when my eldest was about 3.5, and I was pregnant with our second child. And I had terrible anxiety while I was pregnant with my second. And I found it hard to leave the house to take my little one to kinder. So we had this trip that we'd already planned before I was pregnant. So I got myself there, and I had planned, again, before I was pregnant, I'd planned this swimming with the dolphins thing just for me. And my husband was going to, he stayed back at the accommodation with our daughter, and I was heading out, really early in the morning to go swimming with dolphins. And I was just absolutely racked with nightmares and anxiety leading up to it. But maybe not for the reasons that you'd think. So it wasn't, I wasn't scared of jumping into the water, which is unusual for me because I'm not a great swimmer. So you'd think that would be my worry. And I thought that would be fine. And I wasn't worried about getting out on the ship. Like, I wasn't worried about those usual things. But I had this absolute, again, my anxious mind had convinced me 100% that it would be the dolphins that would be a problem. So dolphins, and this sounds hilarious now, but at the time it was really real to me. So dolphins are known, of course, for being really friendly, and, they just look friendly. They look like they're smiling.
That's right.
And there's no reports in the news ever of person attacked by dolphin. Dolphins are...
They're not killers,
They're known for being friendly and really, placid and fun and lovely. But in my mind at the time, highly anxious mind, I started thinking, not all dolphins can be friendly.
Oh.
There must be some rogue, evil ones.
Oh, goodness.
And I might come across them while I'm out there. So in
Isn't
my
it
head,
crazy what the anxious
I'm
mind can tell you?
yeah, I'm going to be attacked by evil dolphins.
By the one single evil dolphin in the whole world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's got to be one.
Yeah.
So
having a bad day.
So yeah. So it was really hard for me to go out there and do that. You know, it seems like such a fun experience, and it was in the end. But there was, you know, when you have anxiety and your mind is, you know, telling you these things, it becomes terrifying.
I'm impressed you went through with it, because to go out on your own to do that, I think in that situation I would have just cancelled. I just wouldn't have done it, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it actually occurred to me to cancel it. Really, as a serious idea.
Yeah.
I just thought, it's booked. I have to do it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
It's crazy, isn't it?
And that's what anxiety can do, is, you know, it can create these kind of things in your head that are bigger. Yeah.
That, you know, that are irrational at some level, but when you're in that anxious mode, it's, irrational becomes rational, really, doesn't it? Yeah,
there's no way to think about it logically.
No, exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. The logic has gone. Yeah. I'm glad there were no angry dolphins there.
No, not that day.
And maybe never since, but yes.
Maybe never.
I am really, really glad that Megan didn't come across any evil dolphins that day, because that would have made that story quite different indeed. After that, or ongoing in that chat, actually, Megan and I chatted some more about our kind of general pre-trip anxieties and how they usually turned out to be groundless. And then Megan said something that I thought was very profound. And she said, traveling reminds me that I can do hard stuff. And I think that's a really important reason that I travel as well. It's too easy to get trapped in the regular routine of home. And then sometimes you can't, you know, you don't need to do anything unusual or out of the ordinary or difficult, because life doesn't necessarily involve that in its day-to-day form. But when you're traveling, then, you know, different stuff happens, and traveling reminds you that you can do hard stuff. So I think that's really important. That's going to go into Instagram as my quote for the week. So thanks for that one, Megan. Now, my next guest today is Laura Waters, and she tells me about, the anxiety connected to her, you know, kind of typical modern day life, and how a very significant trip helped that. So I chatted with Laura at length about this trip, and there'll be some more discussion about it in future episodes. But a few years ago, Laura decided to spend 5 months hiking from one end of New Zealand to the other. So that's a pretty big trip. And as it turned out, that was probably a life-saving and definitely a life-changing one.
Well, I'd just come out of let's call it an unhealthy relationship. And that had sort of, the anxiety sort of snuck up on me over the years that I was in that relationship. And by the time I broke it off, I was in quite a state. And even though the trigger had been removed from my life, I just couldn't get my body to relax. And God, it felt awful. Just couldn't cope with life. My body was absolutely wired for action the whole time. I felt, my body hurt when there were noises. I'd sort of, my skin would flinch, and I couldn't think properly. I'd get halfway through a thought and then I'd forget what I was trying to do, which was very problematic when I was trying to function in life in the city and going to a job in the city. Dealing with, as you say, crowds, that was really difficult. People talking to me, that I found that very sort of invasive. I wanted to create a little cocoon of protection for me. But so anybody asking me a question or phoning me or, somebody on the street wanting to give me a flyer for something was, all of those little things would add to my bucket of stress, I suppose. And I just couldn't get out of it. And so, my breathing was affected as well. That was probably the worst thing, that it felt like somebody was sort of had their hands around my throat, and I could never quite get enough oxygen. I could never quite have that satisfying breath of air that made me feel like I'd satisfied my lungs. And so my lungs actually kind of hurt, It was pretty grim. And then you feel like you're going to faint or pass out because you're just not breathing properly.
Yeah.
So that wasn't good.
No.
So fortunately, this long distance hike that I did came along at the right time, when I just needed to wipe the slate clean and start again. And, after having tried, meditation and herbal drugs, and, I saw a psychologist, none of these things worked. But when I hit the trail and started walking, I was exercising. I had to breathe deep, otherwise I wouldn't have had enough air. I was too busy walking and, just breathing and exercising that I didn't have time to think about the things that had stressed me. And within 3 weeks on the trail, I suddenly realized that all of that had gone. All of the stress had gone. And for it to happen so quickly, as I sort of realized by the end of the trip, as the 5-month trip sort of was starting to come to an end, the anxiety started to come back, and I realized that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I thought, I think there's nothing wrong with me fundamentally or my body. It's just I'm in the wrong place in my life. And so I had to change the environment and make it one that fit me. And I think, I was living an inauthentic life before this trip. I was in a relationship that didn't fit me. I was in a job that didn't fit me. It was a good job, but I'm not into corporate. I'm not into that world.
Yep.
And so, I want adventure and change and travel and nature. And so I just had to change my environment to tick those boxes, and everything was fine. And so since I came back, I very occasionally, if something's not right in my life, I'll start to feel that tightness in my throat again. But this time, when that happens, I listen to it.
Yeah.
And I sort of ask myself, okay, what's the problem here? And in normal life, you would just go, just push on, and we don't listen to our gut. But now I do, and I listen to it, and I say, all right, what's this about? And a little voice will say, oh, I'm not happy doing X, Y, Z. And I say to myself, it's okay, we're going to fix it. We can change this. We're in control. And then there's an immediate release and the anxiety goes. So, I mean, to me, that kind of emotional pain, it's a trigger to tell you, for me, it was a trigger to tell me to change something, that something needed changing. If you lean on a hot stove, pain tells you to take your hand away so that you don't do damage to your cells. And I think emotional pain is the same. It's your body going, hey, something's wrong. You need to change something here. We've got to fix it. And so now I just really try and listen to my body, and I don't suffer those anxiety symptoms anymore. So it's fantastic.
Oh, that's brilliant, isn't it? And I guess perhaps by having that really clean slate experience, now when a kind of an emotional pain, as you describe it, starts, it's just one thing at a time. And so you can identify to deal with it and solve it, rather than, I guess previously there's probably lots of different things causing that. And so that's really hard to deal with and solve because, it's not going to fix it because there'll be something else that's also not helping.
Exactly. And it just becomes very overwhelming too. Once your body and your mind has fallen down this black hole, it's very hard to crawl your way back out. It's far better to, address these things as they pop up so they don't become really bad.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, if nothing else, just that skill is something that will, must have improved your whole life so far, so enormously, and will continue to do so.
Absolutely. And some people sort of criticize others, I think, when they are seeking happiness, but it's not a selfish thing. You've got to look after yourself, and then you're a much better person to be around. You have more patience for people. You can give more of yourself when you've got a nice, steady base.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I would urge anybody, if they're in a struggling place, put the time in. Give yourself the time to find what it is that will, make you happy, because it's important, and you'll make other people happy and contribute more to the whole by doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess, I certainly don't see it this way, but I guess there might be people who think that taking 6 months out of your life to go hiking is kind of a decadent thing to do. But that 6 months investment will put you and like all the people around you in so much better place for, the next 40, 50 years. So, that's so well worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
And it was quite an interesting experience, actually. I caught up about 6 months ago, I caught up with a friend who I'd hiked with on this big New Zealand hike 5 years ago. And I caught up with her, and afterwards she sent me a message and said, I almost didn't recognize you. She said, you look more like you, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yes, I know exactly what you mean, because I feel like me now as well.
Mm.
And it sort of struck me, because I thought, I could, without that trip, I could quite feasibly have gone through a whole lifetime without really knowing who I was and what I wanted and realizing my potential.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's great that I got to that state eventually, but it's also a little scary that, it might never have happened. And I might have just existed for a whole lifetime instead of living to a full potential and enjoying it and finding out who I was and what was going to make me happy. So,
it's scary, isn't it? And there's lots of people who never realise, and that's scary too.
I think there's a lot of people who are just going through the motions, and, we only get one go at this life, so we need to seize it and really live it, without fear.
Laura's story about how a big hike got rid of that anxiety and taught her how to recognise any kind of creeping bits of it coming back, I think is a really important lesson. And as she says, you've got to live your life without fear, because, what's the point of not doing it that way? And that's sort of how I feel too. So I think a lot to be learnt from both of my fabulous guests today. And I think I said it at the start, but I'll say it again. I really appreciate people who can come on and tell these really personal stories, because I know that they will be very helpful and very inspiring for a lot of my listeners. So thank you very much to both Megan and Laura. Now, to find out more about them, for Megan, you can go to meganblandford.net, and her book, I'm Fine and Other Lies, which is about postnatal depression and motherhood. And I read it last year, one of the most fabulous books ever. I'll leave a link in the show notes to where you can find that. And Laura, you can find Laura Waters at her website, soultrekkers.com.au. And equally amazing, her book, Bewildered, which I will also leave a link to in the show notes, or look it up wherever you get good books, because it's an equally amazing book. I feel so privileged to be able to talk to these amazing writers and travellers and interesting people. As I said in the beginning, you may want to listen back to some of our other episodes about travel and anxiety, episode 71 and episode 93. And in the show notes, I'll also leave a link to a blog post I wrote a few years back, which kind of detail my experiences, my personal experiences with anxiety and travel over the years. Certainly something that is never really gone completely and sometimes can flare up for various reasons. Certainly when I began to travel as a parent, that was a whole other set of anxieties, a bit like Megan mentioned when she was terrified of losing her daughters in the crush of the train in Tokyo. So lots of stuff for you to listen and read to. And if you're looking for these show notes for this episode, they will be at notaballerina.com/173. Last but not least, do come over and chat about this in our Facebook group. It's called Thoughtful Travellers. I'll leave a link in the show notes, or just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook. And if you haven't been in that group yet, there's some extra fun going on this year. We have started the Thoughtful Travellers Book Club. In January, we were reading The Art of Travel, and we have just selected for February to read The Year of Living Danishly. And, lots of fun to be able to have a group of people all reading fabulous travel books together. So come and join us there. Other than that, that's all I've got for you today. So thank you very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.